Pro-life not only made them appear virtuous, it had the additional advantage of suggesting their opponents were anti-life, and therefore pro-death. They also came up with a lovely variation designed to get you all warm inside, pro-family. Well, the left wing didn't want to be seen as either anti-life or pro-death, and they knew pro-abortion wasn't what they needed, so they decided on pro-choice. That completed the name game and gave the world the now classic struggle, pro-choice versus pro-life. The interesting part is that the words life and choice are not even opposites, but there they are, hanging out together, bigger than life. And by the way, during this period of name choosing, thanks to one more touch of left-wing magic, thousands of abortionists' offices were slowly and mysteriously turning into family planning clinics. And on the subject of those places, I think the left really ought to do something about this needlessly emotional phrase, back-alley abortions. We don't want to go back to the days of back-alley abortions. Please. It's over-descriptive. How many abortions ever took place in back alleys? Or, okay, in places where the entrance was through a back alley. Long before Roe versus Wade, when I was a young man, every abortion I ever paid for took place in an ordinary doctor's office in a medical building. We came in through the front door and took the elevator, the three of us. Of course, as we were leaving, the elevator carried a lighter load. Then there's the fetus unborn child argument. Even leaving aside personal feelings, the semantics of this alone are kind of fun to unravel. To my way of thinking, whatever it is, if it's unborn, it's not a child. A child has already been born. That's what makes it a child. A fetus is not a child because it hasn't been born yet. That's why it's called a fetus. You can call it an unborn fetus if you want. It's redundant. But you can't call it an unborn child because, not to belabor this, to be a child, it has to be born. Remember? The word unborn may sound wonderful to certain people, but it doesn't tell you anything. You could say a Volkswagen is unborn, but what would it mean? The fanatics have another name for fetuses. They call them the preborn. Now we're getting creative. If you accept preborn, I think you'd have to say that at the moment of birth, we go instantly from being preborn to being pre-dead. Makes sense, doesn't it? Technically, we're all pre-dead. Although, if you think about it even harder, the word pre-dead probably would best be reserved for describing stillborn babies, the postborn pre-dead. By the way, I think the reason conservatives want all these babies to be born is that they simply like the idea of birth. That's why so many of them have been born again. They can't get enough of it. Here's some more left-wing nonsense, this time from the environmentalists, the folks who gave us the rainforest. Save the rainforest. They decided to call it that because they needed to raise money, and they knew no one would give them money to save a jungle. Save the jungle doesn't sound right. Same with swamp. Save the swamp. Not gonna work. Swamp became wetland. Nicer word, sounds more fragile. Save the wetlands. Send money. But I think the environmentalists still have their work cut out for them when it comes to global warming and the greenhouse effect. As I see it, these terms are far too pleasant for people to get all worked up about. For one thing, global is too all-embracing for Americans. It's not selfish enough. Isn't globalization that thing that's been stealing our jobs? Global doesn't make it. And warming is such a nice word. Who wouldn't want a little warming? Similarly, greenhouse effect will never do. A greenhouse is full of plants and flowers, full of life and growth. Green equals life. House equals shelter. The greenhouse effect sounds like something that gives you life and shelter and growth. You're never going to turn something like that into a villain. And the environmentalists have another language problem, this one concerning nuclear energy. Meltdowns. They like to warn us about meltdowns. But a meltdown sounds like fun, doesn't it? Sounds like some kind of cheese sandwich. Would you like some fries with that meltdown? Here's some more of the distorted language of political persuasion. Conservatives oppose gun control. Liberals know control is a negative word, so they call it gun safety. That's about what you'd expect, but it's hard to find words to describe the following distortion. Some of the pro-gun people are referring to gun control as victim disarmament. Isn't that stunning? Victim disarmament. It takes your breath away. Like a gun. Liberals call it affirmative action. Conservatives are less positive. They refer to government-mandated quotas, racial preferences, and unfair set-asides. Rich Republicans want to keep their money in the family, and so the Republican Party began to call the inheritance tax, a pro-tax term, the estate tax, a neutral term, which they later changed to the death tax, an anti-tax term. When liberals talk about spending, they call it investing or funding. Funding means spending money. We need to do more to fund education. On the other side of the ledger, when Republicans need to raise taxes, they call it revenue enhancement. The energy criminals now refer to oil drilling as oil exploration. Instead of Mobil and Exxon, they'd rather you picture Lewis and Clark. When the original Enron story was developing, Bush's people referred to the crimes as violations. They said a review might be necessary, but not an investigation. So I guess if the other guys do it, it's a crime that should be investigated. But if your guys do it, it's a violation that should be reviewed. Liberals call it global warming. Conservatives call it climate change. If you want the individual to sound shady and suspicious, you call him an Iraqi. If you want to upgrade him a bit, he becomes an Iraqi American. If you're trying to clean him up completely, you call him an American citizen of Iraqi descent. When people came to this country primarily from Europe, they were called immigrants and refugees. As they began arriving from Latin America and the Caribbean, we started calling them aliens. Some of them are here illegally. Those in this country who sympathize with that group don't call them illegal aliens. They refer to them as undocumented workers or guest workers. Sometimes they're identified by the purely descriptive term, the newly arrived. Most favored nation trade status was considered too positive a term for China, so it was decided instead to call it normal trade relations. Aside from the language, there's no difference between the two policies. The Nazis referred to the extermination of the Jews as special action. In their version, the Jews were not killed. They were resettled, evacuated, or transferred, and the dead were referred to as the no longer relevant. In Palestine, Arabs refer to the areas Jews have taken over as occupied territories. Jews call them disputed areas. The Israelis call their assassinations of Palestinian leaders focused thwartings, pinpoint elimination, and preventive measures. At one time in Iraq, Saddam Hussein called the hostages he was holding his guests. Countries we used to call rogue nations are now referred to as nations of concern, so we can talk to them without insulting them outright. But as a result of bad behavior, North Korea has been downgraded from a state of concern to a rogue state. Likewise, failed nations are now called messy states. Underdeveloped countries have also been upgraded. They're now developing nations. And finally, during the election that defeated Manuel Noriega in Panama, there were groups of thugs that wandered around beating and killing people and looting stores. They called themselves dignity battalions. If you enjoyed my earlier description of my new system for wishing people a nice day, perhaps you'll be interested in the following equally innovative method I employ in similar situations. The difference is that this attempt to relieve the tedium of short exchanges involves the replies I give as opposed to the good wishes I offer. As an example, when someone asks me how I am, I try to make my answer as specific as possible. I'm not the type to toss off a casual, "I'm fine." I take care to express my exact condition, and thanks to my creative flair, I can choose from a number of options. If I'm in a self-protective mood, a simple guardedly well often does the job. I find also tentatively keen doesn't give too much away. Of course, if there's the least bit of doubt, I simply rely on my old standby, the ever-cautious, I'm fairly well, comparatively speaking. That works nicely, especially if I feel I genuinely have something to hide. If I wish to be a little more open, I'm semi-dandy, thank you for inquiring, is effective and has the added advantage of acknowledging the other person's contribution to the exchange. By the way, should it be one of today's trendy kids, I'm quick to drop a hip and with it moderately neato, in order to show that I'm really a cool guy and not just some old fuddy-duddy. Once again, with moderately neato, I reveal only a limited bit of information.